So to take us through our training routine, our first up is our head coach of our high performance team here at the B.A.A., Terrence Mahon.
Training. Okay, so no marathoners in the crowd, so that's a good one. I was going to tell any marathoner to just go home. You need to recover a little more before you start racing. Like Mark said, we have some programs online. You have some programs in the handouts. But what we wanted to do tonight is just talk a little bit about the general philosophy in regard to training for some of these shorter races. You know, the Boston Marathon, we're so, or the B.A.A. we're so familiar with, and recognize as the Boston Marathon, but we do put on all these other great events. We have an elite mile, 5K, 10K, and a half marathon. And so we want to talk a little bit about what these training is for these other events, because it is often quite different than marathon training. So if you live in the area like I do, you just went through a pretty brutal winter. It ended maybe a week ago. So during the winter time, unless you have access to the indoor tracks, often your training tends to be very long and slow, where it's just about kind of putting in the miles and keeping the pounds down a little bit from the hibernation effect. So now that we've finally broken through and we've gotten a couple nice weekends in a row, we want to think about transitioning from that longer, slower type training that we call base training or winter training, and start to transition more towards quality work. And so the way we do that in the kind of spring and summer, for the most part, we want to think about just decreasing overall training volume. So the need for long runs week after week can get tapered down. And on the other end, where in the wintertime it can get quite risky when we think of working on speed work because it's so cold and or icy underfoot. Here we'll be able to work on some strides and some quicker things just to kind of get your legs going. The warm weather is always quite beneficial for that as well, in terms of not yanking anything, little ligament or tendon issues. So, by focusing on some fast-paced and running interval sessions, let me just get a quick view of kind of what kind of crowd we're dealing with. Is how many people here, let's say train 5-6 days a week or more? Okay, about half. And then, okay, out of the whole crowd, how many people do like an interval session or some quicker pace running in the week? All right, good handful, nice. How about tempo runs? Good crowd. Well, we got a pretty educated crowd. How about like faster sprints or strides? All right, not bad. Well, that's a pretty solid crowd. Okay, we'll go over all those kind of through the course tonight, but I just wanted to get a feel. So if there are any kind of training definition questions, just shout out and say, hey, I don't understand what a tempo run is, and we can kind of go over that a little bit. But in any case, when we talk about training for the 10K specifically here, what we want to look at just in general is talk about when we think of 10K training as opposed to, let's say, 5K training or half marathon or marathon. An easy thing to do is look at it in terms of effort. So if we think of, let's say our heart rate, and our heart rate, maxing out, maybe you have a max heart rate of 200 beats a minute or 180 or whatever it is. If we take the slow end of it and we think, okay, marathon training or marathon racing, a lot of that is done somewhere in this neighborhood of 75 to 85% of your max heart rate. The elite athletes will look to max out and teach themselves to be able to handle running at 80 to 85% of their max heart rate for the whole course of the race. Most of the rest of us, maybe we're in this kind of 65, 75 to 80% range, which is solid. But when we get up towards racing these quicker distances, like the 10K, for example, on a top elite level, an athlete could run closer to 93% of their max heart rate, which is really high if you think about it. For an athlete to run 30 minutes at, close to, 185, 190 beats per minute. Not an easy feat. So it requires a different, mindset in terms of handling that effort and intensity, but also a callousing effect in the training itself. So in order to do that, again, we need to take away from that mindset of running a lot of longer, slower miles and starting to increase the ability to endure the intensity level. So the training does change in terms of more interval-based training or tempo training. Tempo runs, for example, we often run at somewhere between this 85 to 90% level, a lot less than, let's say, our 10K actual race effort, but maybe somewhere closer towards kind of half marathon effort. And you'll see in the training programs, that's when we say half marathon pace tempo or a tempo that's 20 seconds slower than your goal pace, that's what we're talking about. So the heart rate correlation should be somewhere between that 85 and 90%, or maybe as low as 80%, but wouldn't be much lower than that to get the training effect that we're looking for. Okay. So why do we want to do this stuff? And why do we want to do, let's say, things like speed? Well, one of the biggest things we want to do in regard to speed is improving what we would call your running economy. So there's a lot of talk out there, and it's the big buzzword. It's in the shoe market, and with CrossFit and different training modalities, is what's called improving your running economy. Long and short of it is, running economy is about getting a good cadence or a good stride rate and decreasing your ground contact time, or basically how long your foot is on the ground with each step every time you land. So speed work is kind of hidden strength training. Because you're working at a higher intensity, it forces your muscles to contract at a faster rate and your reaction time to have to be faster to maintain that pace. So through the course of this running specific work, in speed work, we improve our running economy. Therefore, stride rate overall gets quicker both at the slower paces and at the higher end paces. So speed work in ways of strides, intervals, and even tempo work will improve your overall running economy, which will then also improve it in all the longer races as well. So it's a great thing to do to kind of add into the program. And we'll show you a little bit more how we do that. But what comes with that cost of working at those higher levels is the need for higher recovery rates. So when we did a lot of, let's say, winter training, where if you did intervals in the wintertime, more often than not, the rest is very short because the heart rate isn't very high. For example, if I'm having an athlete do, let's say, marathon pace intervals or half marathon pace intervals, often the rest is only so much as it gets their heart rate down to below 140 beats a minute. So if I have an athlete that's running, let's say, some mile repeats or 1K repeats, and they're running them at 85 to 90% effort, then for them to get heart rate down to 140 after they rest could only be 45 seconds to a minute. So the recovery is quite short. Now, whereas we start to do 5K intervals or 10K intervals, and the heart rate now starts climbing up to 90 to 95% of max, the recovery rate is going to be much longer because of the exertion that's put forth. So we do need to count that in and understand that it is needed, because the ultimate goal with this is maintaining the quality of the work within the workouts. So if I'm doing some mile repeats at 10K pace or 800 repeats at 10K pace, the ultimate goal is to maintain an even pace throughout, or even get a little bit better. Let's say your goal is to run some 7-minute miles. What we'd like to see is, let's say you're doing 4 times a mile in 7 minutes. We want to have enough rest to be able to build into it so you can hit that last one in 7 minutes, or maybe even a bit better. Whereas in marathon training or half marathon training, it's a lot different. We're just trying to get a bulk of work done, so the fluctuation may be a little bit different. So quality, we always want to emphasize here in this training program, and therefore allow yourself to have a little more recovery. Now, if we have the winter like we did and a very minimal spring, and we transition into a lot of heat and humidity, understand that even may change the recovery through the course of the workout itself. Because of the heat and humidity, tendency for the heart rate to stay elevated longer is going to be high. So it may be that you start out with the workout and have 3 minutes recovery, but you may need 4 minutes recovery later in the workout just because your core temperature is having trouble decreasing. So that's okay because, again, trying to maintain the quality. So just a few things to think about when we're talking about the differences between this kind of 10K based training versus a half marathon and marathon training that we do in the fall and winter.